Hi everybody, this is Dr. Marks, and our topic for today is Introduction to Public Goods. Public goods is a big concept in both economics and environmental economics, and we're going to apply it to what we're seeing in Ecuador. So it's important that we follow this. I'm going to go slowly and keep it very simple. Normally this is a heavily graphical unit, but there's no graphs. We're going to do this purely descriptively. All right, let's get started. Now, most of the time in our economics classes, we're addressing what we refer to as private goods. If you've taken Econ 217 at Longwood University, most of the time you talked about private goods. You looked at markets for private goods, supply and demand for private goods. So what are some examples of private goods? We're talking about things like hamburgers, cars, houses. These are all private goods, and I'm going to characterize it more formally in just a minute. But the key thing that you need to understand about private goods is that the market does an excellent job of providing private goods. In other words, when we say that the market does an excellent job of providing private goods, what we mean by that is that the market provides the right amount of the private good. So we can rely on the market to deliver hamburgers, cars, houses very efficiently. Now, how is this? Well, if there's not enough burgers in Farmville, we know the market will react. For example, somebody will decide to open up some kind of restaurant. So think about Cookout. Somebody determined that there was a market for an additional fast food restaurant in Farmville, one serving higher quality burgers than what we had in some of the other fast food restaurants, and turns out there was a demand for that. They've been very successful. Now, what if the lines are out the door at the restaurant? Well, here's another possible market reaction. If the lines are out the door, then one thing it might do is give somebody an incentive to raise their price. Now, maybe Cookout, you can't raise the price because it's a chain and has to be consistent with other chains. But what if it's your own mom and shop burger store and the lines are out the door and you just can't meet the demand? That might tell you your prices are too low, and so you'd have an incentive to potentially raise your price. So the market can successfully deliver the right amount of hamburgers and at the right price. So when the market can take care of something, we don't need government. So the government doesn't need to interfere in this process at all. We don't need government to interfere at all in the market for burgers. We can rely simply on supply and demand and people reacting to the demand. If it's not met, opening more restaurants, for example. Now, not all goods are private goods, and that's where it gets a little bit more complex. For example, environmental protection, national defense. These are not private goods. It's not going to work the same as it would with a hamburger. So we have to ask the question, do firms have an incentive to sell units of these things? Do firms have an incentive to sell units of environmental protection? Or do firms have an incentive to sell units of national defense? Now, I'm not talking about making airplanes and tanks and selling them to the military. I'm talking about selling shares to you and me. So can some firm open up and sell shares of environmental protection or shares of national defense to you and to me? And you're probably thinking, well, that sounds really ridiculous. Well, that's because it is. The market's not going to work very well for these kinds of things. So will the market do a good job of providing environmental protection or national defense by having somebody open up a company and selling shares to you and me? Obviously, the answer is no. Well, for that reason then, environmental protection and national defense is different than hamburgers. We don't have the same kind of good. Whereas hamburgers are private goods, environmental protection is what we call a public good. So we're going to be making this distinction between private goods like hamburgers and shoes and public goods like environmental protection and national defense. So as we said, environmental protection is an example of a public good, and they have very different qualities than private goods. Now, the market does not do a good job of providing public goods. Remember, we said the market would do a good job of providing hamburgers, but the market's not going to do a good job of providing public goods. We've already said it just doesn't make sense for some firm to open up and sell shares of national defense. That just isn't going to work. So this is an area where the market's not going to work right. So in other words, the market's not going to provide the right amount. And if we tried to let the market deliver public goods like national defense and environmental protection, what's going to happen is that we're going to have too little. So if we rely on the market, we're going to have too little. So the market's just not going to work well. So this is what economists refer to as market failure. And by market failure, we're talking about a situation where the market is unable to efficiently provide the public good. So, public goods are an example of market failure. The market is unable to efficiently provide public goods. So what that means is they're not going to produce the right amount, and as we said, markets would result in too little, if any. So before we move on, let's just quickly recap. Make sure we understand that some goods are private goods. You can give an example, right? Hamburgers, soda, cars, houses. These are all private goods. And the market can deliver private goods effectively and efficiently. It can make sure we have the right amount of private goods. It can price them accurately. Public goods, the market's not going to be successful. And so we have market failure when it comes to public goods. All right, let's move on. As we've said, private goods are fundamentally different from public goods. So let's make sure we understand this distinction by characterizing what we mean by a private good, and then we'll turn around and distinguish what we mean by a public good. So again, examples of private goods: hamburgers, cars, shoes, glasses. We could come up with lots of examples. But the first characteristic of a private good is that they are rival in consumption. Rival in consumption. Now, what do we mean by rival in consumption? And I'm going to explain it very simply. That consumption by one individual prevents consumption by another individual. Consumption by one individual prevents consumption by another individual. So that's what we mean by rival. So think about a rivalry. We're kind of duking it out. Consumption by you prevents consumption by me, or consumption by me prevents consumption by you. So what we're simply saying is that if I eat the hamburger, you cannot. It's rival. So my consumption of the hamburger completely, typo there, sorry, eliminates your ability to consume. So my consumption completely eliminates your ability to consume. So that's what we mean by rival in consumption. We can't both consume the same exact hamburger. So characteristic number one of a private good, they are rival in consumption. The second characteristic, I don't know why it changed that. That should be B. I apologize. Changed it to an A. The second characteristic is excludable. So B, excludable. Apologize. So when we talk about a private good as being excludable, what that means is we can prevent somebody from consuming a private good. We can prevent somebody, hence the term excludable, as in to exclude. So private goods are excludable. We can prevent someone from consuming a private good. Now, how do we prevent somebody from consuming a private good? Well, Usually we use price as our way to exclude. So the marketplace puts prices, and the price tag is how we exclude people's consumption of a private good. For example, if you can't pay the $5 or don't want to pay the $5, then Cookout's not going to give you a tray with a burger and a drink. So, price excludability. Private goods are excludable. So, again, one more time, private goods are A, rival, which means if I consume, you can't, and B, excludable. We can exclude people from consuming them, and it's usually through price. So private goods, very simple. And as I said, most of the time in our Principles of Microeconomics class, if you took that class, you were talking about private goods. So now let's move on to talk about public goods. But notice that I've put characteristics of pure public goods. The reason that I added the term pure public goods is that it's actually a spectrum when we talk about public goods. So I'm going to look at the extreme case of a public good, a pure public good, one that only is a public good. It doesn't have any private characteristics at all. But then I'm going to back that out and I'll show you that there's actually a spectrum of things that fit in the middle. So for a pure public good, we're talking about environmental protection and national defense. So our first characteristic is that they're non-rival in consumption. Non-rival in consumption. Now remember, private goods were rival, but public goods are non-rival. So I bet that means you can figure out what we're talking about here. So if something is non-rival, then consumption by one individual does not affect the ability of others to consume it too. So consumption by one individual does not affect the ability of others to consume. So what we have here, I'm going to call a jointness in consumption. Jointness. Another way of thinking about that is that we can simultaneously consume. So jointness in consumption might also be described as a simultaneity in consumption. We can jointly consume at the same time. For example, is our national defense impacted when someone else moves into Farmville? So let's say I get a new neighbor. All of a sudden, do I get less national defense? Has that person moving to Farmville, Virginia affected my national defense? When we let in 100 immigrants into our country, is our national defense somehow decreased because we have more people? Well, the answer is no. Our consumption of national defense is not impacted when somebody else moves into Farmville. When it comes to national defense, the cost of additional users is essentially zero, right? The additional cost of one additional user is zero. So, pure public goods are non-rival in consumption. There's a jointness in consumption. We can simultaneously consume national defense. My consumption of national defense doesn't diminish your consumption of national defense. The next characteristic, and I apologize, this should also say B, is that pure public goods are non-excludable. Non-excludable. So, private goods were excludable, public goods are non-excludable. So I bet that means you can also figure this out. What we mean is that once a public good is provided, it's impossible to provide the good to some, but not others. So once a public good is provided to society, it's impossible to provide it to some and not others. Or it might be that it's so expensive that it becomes impossible to prohibit somebody. So it's either impossible or just so ridiculously expensive to try to prohibit somebody from consuming it that it really essentially becomes impossible. So what I'm saying is maybe you come up with some kind of crazy scheme, but it would cost $1 gazillion to implement. Well, then essentially we're saying it's impossible to exclude. So, the bottom line, when we have something that is non-excludable, we cannot exclude anybody from consuming it. So, for example, let's talk about air quality. Let's say we increase air quality. Well, once we increase air quality, we can't prevent somebody like Dr. Hank from consuming the clean air, right? So we might say, Dr. Hank is a free rider and he hasn't done anything to benefit air quality. Doesn't matter. Once we improve air quality, he gets to consume the higher air quality regardless of his behavior because it's non-excludable. Oops, sorry about that. So even if Dr. Hank doesn't help us protect the environment, doesn't help us protect air quality, maybe he's driving around in this ginormous SUV that gets 11 miles to the gallon and he's creating lots of pollution, and maybe he leaves his air conditioning on all the time, even when he's out of town, air quality is non-excludable. All right, you with me? Now, we don't have a lot of examples of pure public goods, but the most common ones that we use are national defense, that we've already been talking about. We agree that national defense is non-rival. We can simultaneously consume national defense, and having one more person consuming national defense has no impact on the rest of us. A lighthouse is also a good example. Once we erect a lighthouse, everybody can benefit from the lighthouse's services, even if they're a free rider, even if they never pay any dues to the lighthouse. Maybe we're charging some dues or we're asking for donations for the lighthouse. Once that lighthouse is erected, any boat on the water can benefit from its services. And again, it's non-rival. We can have a lot more boats and still nobody else is impacted. We have simultaneous consumption of the lighthouse services. Well, clean air, or I could be talking about just about any environmental protection outcome, that's also a pure public good. Clean air benefits all of us regardless of our behavior. We can't exclude anyone from consuming clean air, and we can simultaneously consume clean air. Now, you might argue at some point we don't have enough clean air. If we have a whole lot more people move in, maybe other activities eliminate the clean air. But assuming that we can keep the level of clean air constant, having more people consuming clean air doesn't diminish the opportunities for others. So these are examples of pure public goods. National defense, lighthouse, clean air, you get the idea. Unfortunately, when it comes to public goods, we have a free rider problem. And that problem is inherent in the characteristics of public goods. Now, we've talked about the free rider problem already. Public goods, unfortunately, give us the ability to be free riders. Because of the nature of public goods, we have the ability to be free riders. Again, think about the free rider incentive that we've already talked about. We have an incentive to pass the costs off to others. If the environment can get cleaner without my help and without my money, that makes me the best off as possible, right? So back to picking on Dr. Hank. Dr. Hank might drive a big SUV and he might leave his lights on all of the time. And let's say maybe he's not a good steward of the environment. Maybe he's polluting the air. And so essentially he's a free rider. Do we all agree? He's going to get to consume the cleaner air, but he's done nothing to contribute to it. But as we said, because of the characteristics of public goods, he cannot be excluded from consuming the cleaner air. Okay? So we have a free rider problem. Where does that free rider problem come from? Well, it comes from the characteristics of the public good. Specifically, the free rider problem comes from that non-excludable nature of public goods, right? Because we can't exclude Dr. Hank, he can be a free rider, and he has an incentive to be. Remember, non-excludability means that I still get to consume even if I don't contribute in any way. Either financially or through my own efforts, I can still consume a cleaner environment even if I don't contribute to protecting the environment. Again, it's because of the characteristic of non-excludability. So maybe I never donate to an environmental organization. Maybe I drive a big SUV and I have a huge house and I just am not conscious of the things I do that impact the environment. So again, I'm serving as a free rider. I certainly have that free rider incentive. But we have to remember this is rational self-interest because I'm best off when the environment gets cleaner and I don't expend any money or any effort. So again, remember that free rider incentive. I'm best off when the environment gets cleaner, but I don't expend any money or any effort. And we have a lot of people like that. Am I right? You know a ton of people who do nothing to benefit the environment. So essentially, they are free riders because environmental protection is a public good. So let's think about some examples of where people are free riders. Donations to charity are one good example, and this could be for an environmental organization or it could be something like the Red Cross. But I'm sure that most of us are glad that there are charities doing good work, right? We're all glad that the Nature Conservancy does what it does, and we're all glad that Greenpeace does what it does, and when there's environmental disasters in the world and the Red Cross helps out, we're all happy about that. So we're really glad that there are charities doing good work, yet not many people donate money to these organizations. I mean, some do, and a lot of companies do for tax deduction purposes, but we have a lot of people serving as free riders, am I right? Recycling, we've already talked about. We've argued that it's voluntary in most American cities, and for you to recycle, it definitely takes effort, and as a result, participation is very low. So not that many people choose to recycle. Some do, certainly, but not that many. So of course, we understand the free rider incentive. I'm better off when you recycle, right? The environment gets cleaner when you guys all recycle. So I'm better off from your actions, but maybe I'm not willing to impose the costs on myself. For recycling in a lot of communities, you actually have to collect your stuff and bring it to a recycling center, and there's a lot of people not willing to do that. So there's a lot of free riders when it comes to the recycling efforts. Last example, cleanup days at my mom's community lake. My mom lives at Lake Monticello. My mom and dad live at Lake Monticello. And every once in a while they have a community lake cleanup day. And of course, everyone in the community benefits when the lake gets cleaner. This is a lake community. Everyone's house is built around the lake, maybe not directly on the lake, but everyone benefits when the lake is cleaner. Yet, not very many people participate in Lake Cleanup Day. So another good example of the free rider behavior. We could come up with lots of examples. You may have even come up with some of your own. You clearly understand this idea. Now, imagine a world where the cleanliness of our environment was based on how much people donated or how much people were willing to act, their own actions. I mean, what if we simply left the cleanliness of our environment up to people's behavior? Is that a very good idea? Should we simply say, hey, you guys decide how much you're willing to spend, how much action you're willing to take, and that's how clean our environment would be? That's probably not a very good decision on our part, right? Or what if we said the level of national defense is going to be determined by total donations? Everyone just put money in the hat. Whatever that money can pay for, that's how much national defense we'd have. Again, is that a good strategy? Probably not, because people free ride. People are not going to donate because they know once national defense is provided, they get it whether they paid or not. So we have a serious free rider problem, which means we're going to end up with too little. If we simply let the cleanliness of our environment or the level of national defense be dictated by donations or people's actions, we will not have enough of either one. So this is not going to be a good strategy. So how do we solve this problem? Because as we've talked about before, It's a market failure problem. How do we prevent market failure? So again, remember what we mean by market failure. Market failure is where the market will not be able to deliver the right amount. So the market's not going to produce enough environmental protection. The market's not going to produce enough national defense. If we simply rely on supply and demand, we're not going to have enough. So what do we do here? Well, government plays a major role in both of these. Government has a major role in addressing market failure. Usually, government's responsible for providing public goods. Think about it. Doesn't government basically determine how much environmental protection we're going to have? At least in the big components, right? They set the regulations, they do the monitoring. And what about national defense? Doesn't government determine what our national defense investment's going to be? Certainly. So government's responsible for providing public goods. Again, make sure you understand why. It's because the market cannot. The market's going to fail to provide the right amount. The government's going to have to take over this responsibility. Now, how does government do it? They simply use a tax and spend approach. They're going to take our tax dollars, they're going to spend money as they feel is needed. And if government is simply taxing us and spending the money, then it's a lot harder for you and I to be free riders. Now, some people might cheat on their taxes, and in that sense, they're being a free rider. But the level of free riding is going to be much less when we let government provide public goods. So bottom line, government is the provider of public goods because the market won't be able to do it. Make sure you're clear. The market can successfully deliver private goods. The market cannot successfully deliver public goods. So let's move on to talk about the idea of impure public goods. Impure public goods are categories that fall in the middle. So in the middle, we've got this very large group, and these are things that have both public good characteristics and private good characteristics. That's why we're calling them impure public goods. So they're not pure public goods, they're impure public goods because they do have some qualities of private goods. Impure public goods, as we say, fall in the middle. They have qualities of both public and private goods, and a good example would be a road. A road definitely has both public and private good qualities. Another example would be a park. A park can also have public and private good qualities. Third example, television broadcasts can also have public and private good qualities. And I'll expand on that in just a moment. So these are examples of impure public goods. So let's start with the example of a road or a park. They basically work the same way, so I'm going to lump this example together. Now, when no one is on the road or no one is in the park, it's very much like a public good. Because when they're empty, an additional user has no real impact on you, right? So think about driving down a road late at night and there's almost nobody on it, and then one more car gets on the road. Do you agree? It really has almost no impact on you. So at that point, when the park is empty or the road is empty, it's essentially non-rival in consumption. One more person does not diminish your consumption opportunities at all. So in that respect, it's like a pure public good. But this can change. It's not always that way. What about when a lot of people are on the road or in a park? So think about going to a park on 4th of July. There's a lot of people there. So congestion sets in. When congestion sets in, then you've got a lot of people and they start to affect each other. If we have congestion, other users start to impact you. So think about you're there 4th of July trying to find a picnic table and you can't, or you're hearing the radios of other people nearby and you don't really want to, or people are throwing frisbees that are coming too close to where you're picnicking. That's congestion. Do you agree if congestion sets in, then this becomes a rival situation? It's rival in consumption because as more people come, they do diminish your opportunity to consume. Maybe you can't get the amount of space that you want. Maybe you can't get the peace and quiet that you want. Or if we're talking about a road, maybe now congestion is leading to delays. You can't go the speed you want. You're stuck in traffic. We have rivalry. At this point, when congestion sets in, the marginal cost of another user, sorry about that, that should say user, is not zero. Okay? So marginal cost is no longer zero. Now, can we exclude people? Can roads and parks be excludable like private goods? If so, how? Well, think about how you would exclude people on a road. Couldn't we add a toll? Or what about at a park? How can we exclude people at a park? Don't you agree? We could have some kind of admission fee. So the bottom line is we can charge a fee. When we charge a price, when we charge a fee, then it becomes excludable. And we would say it's excludable via a fee or via price. Okay? So roads and parks are examples of impure public goods because sometimes they have public good qualities. You can have simultaneous consumption of a road. You can have simultaneous consumption of a park up until the point where congestion sets in. You can also exclude people from these things by charging a fee. So hopefully you appreciate how these examples, the road and the park, have both public good and private good characteristics. So quickly, let's summarize. Environmental protection is a public good, and we need to make sure we understand public goods are different from private goods. People have a free rider incentive, remember, with public goods because they can't be excluded from consuming a public good. Remember, public goods are non-excludable, so that creates the free rider incentive. This means, of course, the market will not be able to efficiently provide public goods. So while markets can provide hamburgers and cars and houses, markets are not going to do a good job providing public goods like environmental protection or national defense. What's going to happen is market failure. And what we mean by market failure is that we're always going to have less than the socially optimal level. We're always going to have too little. To solve the problem, usually we see government as a provider of public goods. So think about public goods. Government provides national defense. They provide, or they're, the bulk of environmental protection, maybe through regulation, but they certainly are managing the idea of environmental protection. They're responsible usually for building roads, although occasionally we have a private road. They generally are responsible for building parks. Think about our national park system and lots of other examples that we could illustrate. So make sure from this lecture you understand the distinction between private goods and public goods. You understand rival versus non-rival, excludable versus non-excludable. You understand where the free rider problem comes from. You understand the idea of market failure, and you understand government's role in providing public goods. So again, we've just scratched the surface of this. This is a much more technical topic, but for our purposes, treating it very descriptively is fine. Make sure you understand these concepts. You might be asked to apply them in some context later. If you have any questions, let me know. Thanks for listening and have a great day.